both of the speakers who have very prestigious degrees from very prestigious universities. You can look at them. Have written excellent papers, and so I want to save the time for the papers rather than reading something to you that you already have. Professor Andrei Hagiu from Princeton and Salil Mehra from Temple. And I think, Andrei, you're up first? Sure. Okay.
Thank you.
Wait 5 minutes or something?
Absolutely. Is there a clock is there a timer that I can look at, or I can use my own? It's okay.
I have my phone.
I'll just use it, yeah. All right. Well, good morning, and thank you, by the way. Pleasure to be here. This is actually very novel to me. I generally give talks to purely economics or purely strategy audiences, so this is a welcome change from my normal routine. And I'm sure you'll have actually lots of questions. I do promise that I have no equations in this paper, which is rare as well for me. F5. All right, so this is, so my co-author is in National University of Singapore. Both of us have done a lot of work on something that's very popular with economists and with strategy scholars, this notion of multi-sided platforms. So obviously it's related to platforms, but it's not quite the same thing. Very briefly, so in economics, I'm going to stay next to the microphone. So multi-sided platforms has emerged as a very hot area since about the early 2000s. Coincidence, you might say? Probably not. Obviously, it's correlated in some form or fashion with the rise of internet and software industries, and then economists discovered these and thought, well, look, there's some interesting business models that are going on in these industries which we haven't seen that many before. Quick note, even though most interesting multi-sided platforms that you can think of are in IT industries, they're not exclusive there. So I've done a number of cases, there are lots of examples of multi-sided platforms like, say, payment systems, credit cards, shopping malls, which are not in IT. But again, the most complex, where most of the innovation is, it's in information technology platforms. And in parallel, so this is more since the late 2000s, there's been basically a multi-sided platform bubble in the Silicon Valley, which in some strange ways mirrors the bubble in the early 2000s. So if you look at business plans and at what venture capitalists talk about, they talk about multi-sided platforms. Everyone wants to build or invest in multi-sided platforms. And what's interesting is that they're very vague. So they've heard this, again, I don't know what the correlation is. Is it because they've heard it from business school professors or the other way around? I don't know which way the causality goes. But they like to throw around the word. So if you go to Silicon Valley and you want to start a company, you're much more likely to get funded if the word platform appears very often in your business plan. And if the word multi-sided platform appears, then you're really, really likely to get funded. And as a result, there's this search for, let's build the next eBay. And there's lots of examples. Airbnb for apartments. There's lots of companies do car sharing, like Zimride and others. I mean, there's plenty of examples. Let's just build the next multi-sided platform. If you look more deeply, though, the issue is they're not very clear on what exactly do you mean by a multi-sided platform. And most of the research up to date basically focuses on one or two particular aspects of multi-sided platforms. So the notion is a multi-sided platform has indirect network effects between the multiple sides, which is why it's pretty valuable, because it gives us the staying power. And I guess it's related to what Richard was mentioning. You worry that a multi-sided platform tends to lock people in, well, precisely because of these indirect network effects. And most economists and so strategy scholars to date have focused on indirect network effects, expectations, and pricing structures. What we do in this paper is try to move a little bit beyond this and sort of point to certain, which we believe are very important issues that are raised by real-world multi-sided platforms, which are not necessarily explained by this previous literature. So basically three important questions. So number one, what exactly is the difference between a multi-sided platform and a traditional intermediary? So the example that I want you to think about here is what's the difference? What exactly is the difference between eBay and Walmart? You'll say, yeah, sure, it's obvious. I can give you examples in which the difference is much less obvious. What exactly is the difference between a multi-sided platform and, say, an input supplier, or basically a platform? What, like the ones most technology scholars talk to about today. What's the difference between, fundamentally in terms of business model, between Intel, which is a platform, and Microsoft, which is a two-sided platform or three-sided platform. So the example I have here, actually, Sony PlayStation, two-sided. Amazon Web Services, absolutely a platform, but not two-sided. And then finally, some companies are in the interesting position of being able to choose. So you can choose either to be a multi-sided platform on the one end of the spectrum, or what we call a reseller or a traditional intermediary at the other end of the spectrum. So you can choose to function more like eBay or more like Walmart. So where do you want to place yourself on this continuum? So these are the questions that basically we address in this paper. So let me see, okay. So to sort of address these questions, we kind of propose a new definition. So something that we believe is a little more, is driven by practical examples, and I think it sort of clarifies a little bit better what people have in mind when they talk about multi-sided platforms. And again, I think it's important to realize that these are, and what we're trying to do is separate what are the fundamental drivers of multi-sided platform business models relative to other types of businesses. So here's the definition. It's basically organizations that create value primarily by enabling direct interactions between multiple affiliated groups of customers. The two key points here are direct interactions and affiliated customer groups. So I'll just focus on those, give you first some examples. So suppose we have, suppose it's a two-sided platform for simplicity. There's the platform in the middle. Does that work? Yes. Actually, it doesn't. Anyway, so platform's in the middle. You have two sides. Two things have to happen. The two sides have to get affiliated in some way. I'll talk about this. And there have to be direct interactions between the two. Just quickly, in case you're not all that familiar with this literature, some clear two-sided platforms. I think everyone agrees. eBay, Rakuten is essentially the equivalent of eBay, but a little bit different in Japan. American Express, PayPal, the iPhone, PlayStation 3, I can go on and on. There's plenty of those. And just so you don't think it's all two-sided, obviously there are examples of four-sided, three-sided, four-sided platforms. Facebook currently four-sided, right? You have all these sides. Now, there's some interesting, again, the two interesting points, the two interesting subtleties are direct interactions and affiliation. And those are the ones that I want to talk about. And I think this should be particularly interesting for law school audience, because there's some point, I mean, again, we're economists, and we're mostly interested in the implications for economic costs and also implications for strategy. But I'm sure there's some interesting legal twists that we haven't thought of. So I'm sure you'll have lots of questions about this. So the first one is, what does it mean to enable direct interaction? What do we mean by that? So this is basically, there's one thing. A and B, so the two sides, have to maintain direct control rights over the key terms of the interaction that happens between them. So I can think of three ways in which two parties can directly interact with each other on these platforms. They can enter a contractual relationship, and that contractual relationship is somehow enabled by the platform. They can be, so A can consume a product supplied by B, but that needs the platform in some sense. So this will be the iPhone. And finally, A and B can simply communicate. No monetary transaction, but just communicate on the multi-sided platform. So this would be, I don't know, Match.com or even advertising supported media. Now, here's a table, which I think, again, I don't want to go too much into details. I mean, I'm happy to discuss this more specifically in questions. But there's some interesting differences, so examples that illustrate sort of the difference between the two. So on the one end, you have multi-sided platforms that enables direct interactions. The other extreme, you have intermediaries that will look, somehow they look two-sided. And by the way, they have indirect network effects, which is why indirect network effects is a relatively poor characterization of multi-sided platforms. But they're not two-sided because they do not enable direct interactions. So this one's obvious, right? On eBay, buyers and sellers interact directly. You buy from a seller, you know who the seller is, and vice versa. 7-Eleven and Walmart, to some extent, perform very similar functions between the suppliers and the buyers. But the key difference, obviously, is that they buy the stuff and resell it to us. There's no direct interaction between suppliers and buyers. Here's another one. What's the difference between PlayStation 3 and this is a picture of a video game arcade, in case you weren't able to make this out. So so PlayStation 3, obviously two-sided, right? There's game developers, I had it earlier, game developers and users. Video game arcade, relatively similar. I need to get the games, so whatever, the consoles from game developers, and I have users on the other side. The issue, though, with the video game arcade, the user, when they go to the arcade, they don't buy the game from the developer. They buy a service from the arcade. So the contractual relationship, the responsibility, so the only contractual relationship is with the video game arcade. So in this example, the game developers only function as suppliers to the arcade. Very different from Sony PlayStation. Very, very different. And here's the sort of, I would say, probably the subtlest one. I'm assuming most of us use at least one or both of these. So the Apple App Store, if you have an iPhone, you buy applications there, and then iTunes. Now, this being a sophisticated legal audience, I'm sure you read the fine print when you buy products on these, so I don't need to explain this, right? No? Okay. Maybe I do. So the App Store is two-sided because if you look at the contract, it says explicitly anything that goes wrong with the application, it's the responsibility of the developer. So you buy your contract, even though you buy it from the Apple App Store, your contract or the responsibility for fulfilling, basically delivering the product is with the application developer. If you go to iTunes and you buy music, anything that goes wrong with the download, with the song, your point of contact is Apple. So Apple takes full responsibility for this. It's interesting because these are digital products. So it's not about, this illustrates the fact that this is not about, the distinction is not really about inventory risk. Walmart does not really take 100% inventory risk. That's not the key point. The key point is the direct interaction in this case is controlled completely by Apple, and they take full responsibility. Not so in the other case. And so from our perspective, from an economic perspective, well, these are very different business models. This one has much higher costs for Apple. That one, much lower costs. This one, Apple can dictate much more, so Apple is Apple are control freaks, so they kind of dictate the terms in both of these, but they have much more control in this one, so which they can use to their advantage. There are lots of other examples, but sort of if you want to, if I want to draw this in the simplest possible way, this is the difference. So the multi-site platform business model looks like that. The reseller, traditional intermediary business model looks like this. And an interesting question, I'll come back to this, is suppose you have a choice. And there are companies like Amazon who basically constantly think, should we be closer to this or should we be closer to that? So there's some interesting trade-offs there. Very briefly, the second key subtlety, affiliation. So what does it mean for the two sides to be affiliated? Basically, the best characterization that we came up with is to say the two sides have to make some kind of specific ex-ante investment, which is absolutely necessary in order for both of them to be able to interact on the platform. So examples would be paying an access fee or incurring some kind of opportunity costs. That could be, going to the shopping mall. So you actually affiliate with the shopping mall by going there. Buying the PlayStation, you're incurring a cost in order to be able to play the games. Now, why is that important? Well, here's an example. Everyone presumably is familiar with the Kindle, with the Amazon Kindle. Most people are not that familiar with the key input or the key platform in the Kindle, which is the electronic ink. So that electronic ink is supplied by MIT Media Lab spin-off, which is actually a very interesting case study. Basically, no one's ever heard of them. And the reason is, well, they're the key input supplier. And by the way, not just the Kindle, but also the Sony ebook reader and a few others. So in some sense, you would think, well, that's the operating system. It's not quite the operating system because they do not, the relationship between users and ebook publishers is controlled by the device manufacturers. E-ink just has no control over that. So in this sense, they're an input supplier. They do facilitate a direct interaction between ebook publishers and users because that can only happen with their technology. But the problem is the one thing that they're missing is that they do not have affiliation, any kind of affiliation, by either users or ebook publishers. I talk to them all the time. They would like to have that. E-ink would be delighted to say, there's actually two ways. Actually one more point. So clearly E-ink is not a multi-sided platform. No one would argue that. They wouldn't, even if consumers, so if most people would be familiar with them, even if they were able to say, E-ink inside, so people would be familiar with their brand, we would argue that's still not enough. That doesn't make this two-sided. So the question is, how could they become a two-sided platform? There's two ways. One of them, suppose they make their standard, so for ebooks, proprietary. If they make that standard proprietary, then it starts to look more like Windows, and then If they're able to control that, they can say, they can go to ebook publishers and say, you have to get a relationship with us. We have to provide you the standard, and maybe maybe you have to pay us in order to be able to publish books in this standard. So that's one option. The other option is, why don't we try to create an ebook store? So just like Amazon has one. Well, obviously the answer is, there's no way in hell Amazon or Sony are going to allow this tiny company to do any of those two things, right? I mean, they're just not going to allow them to control the end customers. So, I mean, this is I guess this is the best illustration that I have, but there's tons of startups in Silicon Valley that are struggling with precisely this issue. They have the potential of being two-sided platform, but they're not, because they're missing affiliation of one or both of those sides. So they have to go through powerful distributors like Amazon in this case. So again, just to represent this in the simplest possible way, MSP looks like that. Input supplier, basically, you only have side A, and side A has a direct relationship with side B, but side B is not directly affiliated. All right, so key questions, and I guess this is the main purpose, this is the main goal of the paper, is what are the strategy implications? So one key observation here is that this definition of multi-sided platforms based on direct interactions and affiliation does not imply, bright line distinctions. It's not, this is multi-sided up to here, and from here on it's not multi-sided. No, it's actually, in many cases, it's basically a continuum. So there's a lot of gray zones. And our point is basically, it can be actually an interesting question to think about, well, where do you want to place yourself along this continuum? Do you want to be more of a multi-sided platform, or do you want to be more of a reseller? Multi-sided platform or more of an input supplier? So given that I only have, how long do I have? 5 minutes. I'm only going to talk very briefly about the first one of these. So what does the trade-off between multi-sided platform and input supplier look like? And I'm just going to skip the other one. So here's a way to think about it. And sort of the best example still, I think, is Amazon. Amazon, when they first started, 1998, they were a pure reseller. They would buy and resell books. No, they didn't really take all the inventory risk, but they were a pure reseller in the sense that there was no direct interaction between suppliers and buyers. Very different today. They actually figured out that for a lot of products, it makes more sense for them to broker a very eBay-like relationship between third-party merchants and buyers. And it's explicitly stated in their contracts. There are a lot of merchants which completely control the interaction with buyers. The immediate question is, why would Amazon do that? And you can immediately see this is probably more profitable. So as you go from pure reseller to the pure MSP, what you gain is it's lower cost, so therefore the margins are higher, at least the percentage margins are higher. The reason they don't go all the way is that for some products, actually, they're more profitable, so in percentage margins, MSP is clearly more profitable because the cost base is lower. In terms of absolute margins, the reseller mode can actually sometimes be more profitable, and they're always trying to strike a balance between the two. Again, I can talk more in detail about this one. Here's another one. So by the way, you can apply this to lots of companies, lots of industries with very interesting results. Professional service firms. Well, I don't know. I should have used, I guess, a law firm, but I just can't think of any example of a law firm off the top of my head. So fill in your favorite one here. McKinsey & Company, or all the top three, I guess, top consulting firms, they're pure resellers. They buy the inputs, which are the professionals, sell them to clients, and they completely control the relationship with clients. You may or may not know that there's a bunch of companies that emerged since the early 2000s, which actually want to function, sort of disrupt. So this is talking about Schumpeterian competition. They're saying this is ridiculous. There's a better way to do this. We'll create the eBay for professional services. And there's at least two of them, so Gerson Lerman Group and A-Connect. Yes, they're a little different than McKinsey Company. They don't quite serve the same customers, but the idea is basically there's no reason for us to hire the professionals. We'll just broker a direct relationship between the two. Got it. And then there's even more interesting one, Odesk, which is pure eBay for trading work online. So the other example I had here was Harvard Business School. I think Harvard Business School would be very unhappy if we claim that they're anything else but a pure reseller. All right, so here's actually, so these are actually very interesting startups. So another one is car sharing services. You know Zipcar? Zipcar buys and owns their, so they buy a fleet of cars and then they provide that service to consumers. And Zipcar basically was founded on the premise of disrupting the car rental companies. Well, Zipcar is being disrupted today by a number of startups, which are basically saying, this is the reseller mode, we're going to do the eBay mode. So they're trading essentially, they're allowing people, so let's say if you have a car, you don't use it that much, you can rent it out online using an online platform to people who don't have a car who like to use it for a few hours. So lots of examples. So finally, so out of all of these, I mean, I think the interesting point is how do you choose between the two? And there's at least 3 dimensions here that I want to finish with. So how do you choose between being an MSP or reseller? One of them is quality uncertainty in the long tail. Very quickly, if quality is uncertain and if the products which you're trying to trade are relatively long tail, so low demand, it makes more sense to function like eBay. This is what eBay is. It allows basically to, it allows buyers and sellers to connect for goods which are relatively rare and in low demand. If, on the other hand, goods are very frequent, quality is more certain, then you probably would go for the reseller mode. Profitability and growth, this is a point that I was trying to make with Amazon. And then finally, buyer demand and preferences. If there are lots of complementarities between the goods in buyer demand, or if, let's say, buyer service is very important, you'd probably choose the reseller mode over the MSP modes. Again, I'm happy to elaborate more on this, but I just want to make sure I finish on time. So this is the last slide. Just 30 seconds.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I guess what I want you to take away from this is basically there are complementary views of MSPs. Up to date, everyone was thinking of MSPs in terms of indirect network effects, and I think that's very valuable. There's been a lot of good research on this. Our point is that you can get very interesting, so novel research ideas, and also it basically, our definition allows you to understand a little better the practical, some of the practical issues that arise with multi-sided platforms, which are not captured by the view solely relying on indirect network effects. It's not a bright line distinction. This is MSP, this is not MSP, it's a continuum. And then finally, it places the emphasis on what we believe are novel strategy and economic aspects. So it's not about pricing, it's mostly about positioning. Again, MSP versus resellers, MSP versus regular firms or input suppliers. And we hope, obviously, that this will lead to more research and different style of modeling for MSPs. Thank you, and sorry for running over.
No, you're fine. Why don't you stay there
I will.
for Q&A?
Sure,
You have a mic.
I do.
So we've got some time in between the papers for some questions from anybody who has them for Andrei. So questions? Comments? David.
You mentioned the venture capital industry having this penchant for two-sided markets. Is there any deep wisdom behind that, or is it just that they observe a number of successes?
So they're basically, and I talked to, and it's actually interesting that I go to Silicon Valley quite a bit today, and so their idea is, they've probably heard this from economists. Multi-sided platforms and marketplaces have network effects. That's what makes their staying power. That makes them hard to displace. Anything that's a marketplace is good to invest in because it will become the next eBay. There's lots of interesting examples in which this doesn't work. So I think we'll talk about intellectual property later. Intellectual property is a very interesting industry where people have tried for the past 10 years to build the next eBay, and it just doesn't work. And it doesn't work for very good reasons. I mean, you have to look at the product. I mean, some products are just not. I mean, that's my point about MSPs and resellers, is that in some industries you're actually much better off trying the reseller mode. That's the only mode that can work for lots of good reasons. So for them it's just about indirect network effects, and they also see this thing that actually multi-sided platform is really nice because you don't have to build the infrastructure, which is, well, good or bad, right? I mean, it makes it, I guess, easier to build, but then you ask, okay, what's your competitive advantage? Why can't anyone come in and build the next multi-sided platform? So that's how they think about it.
There was another in the back.
Sorry, yeah. And then Richard.
I guess you could define affiliation a little bit better, because when you said 7-Eleven, I later thought, okay, so for the Slurpee there, MSP.
Yeah.
It's a product you can only get there. But for, I guess, more common brands that they happen to carry, they're a reseller. But, so does affiliation also include either brand or store loyalty?
Yes. So I would say in the
What's the hard definition?
right. So hard definition means you're affiliated with an intermediary. I'm not going to say it's MSP or reseller because it could be both. You're affiliated with the intermediary if you have to make a specific investment in order for you to be able to trade with with someone on that intermediary. So in 7-Eleven, you're right. The user, so the consumer goes to 7-Eleven. That's that counts as affiliation. The brands, the suppliers, either white labels or famous brands, they have to contract with 7-Eleven to bring their goods. So that counts as affiliation. I'm saying, so the affiliation is there. What's not there is the direct interaction. They're interesting. So the subtlety with affiliation is, I mean, I can give you, so there's a bunch of startups, for example, that say, the latest one that I can think of is something like Groupon. So Groupon is two-sided. They have to contract, the merchants have to contract with Groupon to make their discounts available. Users have to go to Groupon to get those discounts clear. There's a bunch of startups today that are trying to do deals, daily deals, for small, medium-sized businesses. They go and contract with merchants to provide discounts. So that's one side, affiliates. They have a lot of trouble getting consumers to basically go to their website. So what they do is they partner with large distributors like Amazon, Intuit, and other companies that have relationships with small, medium-sized businesses. And then they go to the VCs and say, we have access to millions of customers. But if you look at it more closely, those are not their customers. So they're not affiliated with that particular company. They're affiliated with their partners. So the partner has all the power in this relationship because the customer is affiliated with them. So the only way they could get affiliation in that case would be, let's say, you ask the customers to sign up on your website, and some of them are trying to do that. So you can actually get really, really technical, but it's interesting because it's a huge point of contention between, at least for the online ones. Sorry. Yeah.
First, comment, is it true to say, in the broader sense, that what's really going on is a competition for customer relationships? And I'm talking about from the 1970s and on, and this is sort of just continuing, moving to service and trying to get the relationship.
So I think right.
Question is, and it seems that what they're trying to do is sort of include, to make this customer relationship work, include sort of more social, personal, small-scale exchange in competing with the more impersonal exchange that's been going on.
Yes.
Trying to create value by tying the value of the small exchange. What they're really after is customer relationship.
So one, I completely agree. So a lot of affiliation is about getting the customer relationship. But so I guess one of the main points we're trying to make, just having your brand, the fact that you say powered by my company, does not mean you have a meaningful affiliation. So my example here, actually, we can go back to the Intel example. People always look at, Intel and Microsoft, I mean, it's very clear the balance of power has always favored Microsoft. And the reason is Microsoft owns the customer, so they own the developers, they own the relationship with users. Even though Intel did Intel Inside, sure, they got them some benefit, but basically Microsoft calls the shots because they own the interfaces, so they control that. For these guys online, you're absolutely right. It's basically, it's all about, social, having who controls the data, the customer data, who basically, are you affiliated with my social network or with my partner's social network? So it's, it's basically about customer relationship in a more granular sense. So I missed the point about social and local.
That's the point, and the point is then the next step is, of course, well, if that is the case, that it's a little bit more social, low scale and so on, compared to the more impersonal, how, from an economic point of view, how efficient, in an economic sense, is sort of this shift towards a little more local, small-scale exchange, en masse, though.
Right. So, the costs are very different. Right, this is one of the struggles that all these companies have. They would like to have you want to have at the same time broad affiliation by people, but at the same time want to have a lot of local information. So, that's what's going on. Everyone's trying to do that, basically. So everyone's trying to partner with as many companies as possible so they say, we have access to that many customers. Then the question comes, who really owns that relationship? And importantly, one of the key pieces, who owns the customer data?
We're going to stop there
Sure.
so we have time for both papers. Please join me
Yes.
in thanking
Thank you.
Andrei.